All right, in this lesson, we're going to take a little pit stop and we're going to talk about color matching and understanding color grading through the color matching process. Before we do that, I actually just got back. I know some of you were asking me, what's going on, Matt? Are you going to put up more lessons? And I am. So I just got back from Indiana. I was visiting a friend of mine who is a teacher at Purdue University, and I was visiting their incredible VFX department, and they happen to just get in some Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4Ks. I have mine coming in a couple days, but I got to experiment with the Metabones adapter and the lenses and so forth. For you compositors out there that are starting out, and also filmmakers, obviously, this is the camera to get. I had looked at my friend Dan and looked back at the screen at what we were recording, and we were just in shock at the quality that we were looking at. Why get this camera? It's $1,300. It shoots RAW, 60 frames per second. There is a slight rolling shutter on it, which is a kind of like wiggle effect if you take a very fast pan. But overall, tracking can be done rather successfully. It shoots basically 4K DCP, digital cinema projection. So if you were going to make films to go to Netflix, I believe they require RAW, and they require a certain pixel aspect ratio and pixel resolution. So if you were making films, this is the perfect camera to start out with. And if you're a VFX artist, this is the perfect camera to shoot plates with, because you're getting RAW. And not only with $1,300 do you get a camera, but you also get DaVinci Resolve Studio. Now, DaVinci Resolve Studio, I believe, is going to be the go-to editorial package in the future, and it also contains the rival to Nuke, which is the program Fusion, which is a compositing program. And this is an amazing tool. There is some little quirks about it, but overall, it's pretty incredible. It has an online editorial. We were actually playing back RAW in real time, which was crazy. We had a very fast computer for that. We were color grading RAW with DaVinci Resolve, which is within Studio. There's an audio editorial system within this. It's all in one: editing, color grading, finishing. It's just absolutely unbelievable. So you could export out plate shots, shoot plate shots, export out shots, and get a really nice footage that you can do, scene replacements and, whatever you want, cleanup work. So again, here it is. It's at $1,300. Of course, it does not include a lens, but it does include DaVinci Resolve. I have a great video that's one of my top videos. I think it's like, I don't know if it's like 50,000 views or something. It's one of my top videos on understanding, kind of a run-through, run and gun of understanding DaVinci Resolve. I highly recommend, if you are anybody in the realm of VFX or even film, obviously DaVinci Resolve is a program to learn. And again, I have a free video that kind of shoots you through it really quick. It does have some compositing elements with qualifiers, which technically are keys for color grading and stylized key color grading. But you want to definitely get a hold of an understanding of vectorscopes, histogram, and so forth when we get into color grading. So that's something that is very important to understand and go through. I'm not going to go too much into those elements, but they do play a part in the color correction process. But in this case, I'm just going to show you matching blacks, matching whites. And again, the colorist is the person that takes the CG that you're going to, something you're going to put CG into, gets you a rough color grade, a neutral color grade. You put the CG in, and then they finally put in the final work, the final color grade. So, for instance, I didn't get to see my commercials that I did for Samuel L. Jackson with the Capital One commercials until I was watching TV, and just all of a sudden it popped up in front of me. And I would notice what the colors did compared to the work that we did as a team. So as a team, we had it specifically done with a neutral color grade, but then he went in and added some reds and the blacks, and he did crush the blacks and the whites pretty heavily, which, again, in everyone's opinion and what they think of the final look is what it is, but I personally thought it was a little bit too heavy of a crush of the blacks and whites on some of the VFX shots. But regardless, this is the program to learn if you want to start understanding more about color, because you should be, to a certain degree, a colorist, obviously, when it comes to compositing. And this is the program to really get into histogram, vetroscopes, parades, all the goodies that come with basically color grading. So I want you to open up the color match run. Basically, you can create this from anything. You can create this from whatever you want. Just in this case, I used a ramp, a grade, a clamp, or a radial grade, clamp. And what you have here is two different separate elements. So you can see the backplate, if I take a look at it, is just this backplate. Now what's so special about this? Well, it's tinted. The general color of the backplate is this sort of like, pink color. So it has a very faded, if I take a look at the ramp real quick, you could see it has no absolute white values here. In fact, if I were to sample this color, you can see the values in here, if I kind of play with them, are the values of like 0.5, 1, it says 1 here for the red, right? So if I hit R for red, you can see it's very red, right? But it's not exactly 100% 1, 1, and 1 as in regards to the values. Over here, the shadows are not absolute black either. You can see the values are like 0.03, 0.02, 0.02. And I also added a little bit of a bluish tint to the shadow areas. So that's our backplate, and that's going to dictate the CG. So when you color grade, you're either color grading the CG, which would be, in this case, this ball, to match to the background plate. In the Sam Jackson commercials that I worked on, we had to match Samuel Jackson to the actual CG background. So I always kind of think of it as whatever is smaller in the shot most likely will be the thing that will need to be color graded to match the bigger thing in the scene. So for instance, in this case, the bigger thing in the scene is this background, and we wanted to have the CG, which we rendered out of Maya. In this case, we're just demonstrating with a ball radial. And we want to match it up. So we want to match the blacks and the whites. So that's the first thing you do when you get into CG is you match the blacks and the whites. The dynamic range of these two elements, the backplate and the CG, are dramatically different. So for instance, if you take a look at the backplate, if I hit the letter Y to go to luminance, you can see it's very muddy. You don't have very bright highlights. You have very dull, milky shadows. If I go to the CG, though, we have a very defined dark, and a very bright white. See that? So we have to match our blacks and our whites, and just by looking at these from a standpoint of a luminance information, you can see they're dramatically different in dynamic range. So we have to match those. We also have to match the tint color of the shadows from this shadows and the highlight tint to this highlight. And again, the one that's calling the shots is the background plate. We are going to conform this yellow circle to the color scheme of this background plate. So this is a very, very, very brief example of color grading or color matching. So with that said, we are going to color grade the actual CG, which is the ball. So I'm going to add a grade node to the ball. And I'm going to put my viewer to this grade node. Okay? So now we're going to have to set our blacks and our whites for this grade node before we match it. So under black point, I'm going to click on this little dabber here. I'm going to zoom in to where you can see we got those very warm values in the shadows, which I did for this sphere. And I'm going to hold down Shift, Control, and Alt. If you're on a Mac, it's Shift, Control, and Command. But I'm going to sample the darkest dark in here, and the way you can find that is by coming in here and taking your gamma and bringing it up, and you'll see that this is the brightest area here. As I bring up the values and hit the letter Y if you want, you could see this here. So I'm going to go ahead, and now when you do this with real world things, you should be doing stuff that's basically what you would consider your neutral values. So anywhere that like grayscale value areas, okay, within your shot or whatever your object is. So sometimes people will shoot cards and so forth, the gray cards and chip charts and all that to kind of allow for the matching of this stuff. So I'm going to go to my luminance information. I know this is the darkest dark area of my shot, so I'm going to sample that by holding down Shift, Control, and Alt. And I'm on a PC, by the way, so I'm going to go ahead and click that. Now, as you can see, it's not resampling the sample when I have all these buttons down, specifically Control. So that's the important part. So that basically defined that area as black. So anything of that value or less is going to go black. So if I sample up here or here, it's going to keep doing that. See that? So I'm just going to sample this, define the black point. Now go ahead and click it off here. Hit the Y button. And now we're going to define the white point. So I'm going to click here, and I'll choose the white point. Now white point, obviously, if I hit the Y button, I could take my gamma down, and I know that this is the brightest white area. So I'm going to go ahead and click the white point, hold down Shift, Control, and Alt, and sample that area. And you see it's very close to the value of 1, 1, and 1, but not perfect yet. All right, so if you take a look at this thing in the RGB mode, put your viewer to it, you can see that it's been basically redefined. It almost looks like it's kind of changed a little bit, and that's just because we have to define those 2 points. Now comes the lift and the gain. So the lift of the gain is like brother-sister. The black point is like brother-sister to the lift, and the white point is brother-sister to the gain. So you can see like this is black, and this is white and white. So what it does is the lift obviously is going to, when we set the lift and the gain based on the background of the darkest dark of the background and the brightest bright of the background, we will actually conform this whole image to match with this. So with my viewer, I can now take this viewer and put it to the backplate. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to click on the lift, click here, and I'm going to go to the darkest dark, which is over here. And again, the way you find this again is actually hitting the letter Y and actually lifting this up. You can see that's the darkest dark. Right, pretty easy. And I will hold down, in this case, I will only have to hold Shift and Control to pull this off. So I'm going to come over here, make sure that's there, and choose the darkest dark, and use Shift and Control. Okay, so I'll go ahead and pull that off. Go back to luminance here. And you'll notice, you can't really see it too well, but it actually sampled a very bluish, milky shadow area there. Now let's go over to this area, which obviously isn't very bright white. I'm going to click on the gain here. The same thing again, you usually bring this down and set this to RGB, or sorry, luminance. And you can see by adjusting the gamma down, we see that this is the brightest area. Right? You can also bring your exposure up a little bit. You can see this is the brightest area. So I'm going to make sure I click here, hold down Shift and Control, and sample at least more than 1 pixel this area here. So now you can see the value that it's collected for the gain is a very pinkish white for a white point. So I'm going to take these 2 away, turn them off, all right, and hit the letter Y. So now let's take a look at our grade and see how it looks. All right, so let's take a look at the before and after. I'll turn it off and on. So it has, to a certain degree, started to shift the colors in here. So it looks like I'm having an issue here. Let me see here. So I'll put this. Okay, so I have to take this grade, and because there's an alpha, I have to do unpremult by RGBA. Or, as I told you before, good practice is to add an unpremult here, and then a premult. So anytime we color correct, we have to unpremult, grade, and premult. My mistake. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look. There we go. Alright, so let's take a look at the grade before and after. So you can see it's starting to conform to this footage. So you can see the blacks here are this dark blue, and it's conformed the shadows to a dark blue, a very lifted dark blue, I should say. So it's not dark, dark black, it's actually a lifted gradient. So if I hit the letter Y to go to luminance, you can see the blacks have been lifted. See that? And the brightest white has been conformed to this very dull pink. See that? But in general, the color of this object hasn't changed from what it originally was. So for instance, you would assume, well, Matt, why isn't this 100% pink? I want it pink, just like this. Well, that's not the way color correction works. If somebody has a very orange, flesh tone, like a human being, say like, just somebody with regular flesh tone, regular skin, fair skin or whatever, flesh tone, and you try to color grade them to a green background, or maybe like a forest that's behind them. Well, you might accidentally, in that process, you would think like, well, if that's the case, then the human being would turn green. But that's not how things work in real life. Things still retain their original color information. They've just been slightly shifted towards the background plate in the shadows and the highlights. So really we're talking about adjusting the highlights and the shadows. The color of the information between the shadows and the highlights is still from the original. So you can see if I take this and undo it, we still have that kind of remnant of this yellow color. But at least we've matched our blacks and our whites. Now with this grade node, we now tweak this with multiply, offset, and gamma. Now be aware that multiply actually adjusts, it doesn't touch your absolute blacks, but it does adjust your highlights or your white point. So if I pull this up, now you can see that the white point is not matching anymore. So that's sort of a little bit illegal, but you can make some changes in here. The first sort of changes you can do before making any slight adjustments to multiply, offset, or gamma is to play with the gain that you have here and the lift. You don't really ever touch this again unless you need to, but these two you can adjust. So if you feel that the shadow area needs to have a little bit more matching to this, it seems still a little too dark, you can come into the lift and click on the little color wheel by holding Control and click the color wheel. So I'll pull it out like this. And I could say, okay, I want a little bit, I'm not happy with that. Maybe I want a little bit more blue. Or maybe I want to add, take the luminance of that and lift it up a little bit. See that? So now it's matching a little bit better. So you can tweak this, and you can also tweak the hue and, temperature magenta. If you feel like you need a little bit more blue there to match, that's fine. It's up to you. And then you have the gain information. So I can now hit the color wheel, hold down Control, and click on the color wheel, pull that over. And now I can adjust the whites and say, well, you know what? I want that to conform a little bit more to this color here. So this is pink, and obviously if you take a look at where pink's at on the spectrum here, again, we're looking at a mix between red and magenta, right? So red and magenta, what does that mean? Well, either I have to push towards red, or in this case I'll push towards magenta. So I'm going to try to pull that more like that, and now I'm conforming more closely to this color here. But how much do you want to push it depends on how much you want to retain the original color of the object. In this case, this is starting to match up in regards to the blacks and the whites. Now, there also comes the aspect of the gamma. So the gamma is really, gamma locks down the absolute blacks and the absolute whites, which would be here and here. But we'll take the gradient information between these 2 points and either make the object darker or brighter by a logarithmic curve gamma up and down. So if I feel that this background plate is very bright and yet the object is a little too dark, I can take the gamma and bring it up. See, now it's matching a little bit better. See that? At first it looked a little too dark. So obviously this is a great example of just what you want to play with. And then you have the offset too. So you can see I can take the whole object off and on. Now the offset again is going to change your absolute whites, your white point and your black point. So you got to be careful with this You could come in here to your offset and change the actual hue, right? But even changing color information can adjust information in the blacks and the whites. But this is just a perfect example of color grading the best you can. Now we're going to show you a couple other examples of things you can do to kind of color match this. So for instance, one last thing you can do here is something that I see a lot in production and with a couple of guys that are now working at big time production houses, and that's using Hypose for the black point. So even if you did a rough color grade on this, let's say the color grade you only mix it about half or something, right? And you wanted to get the blacks to be a kind of mix with the backdrop. An interesting technique for color correction that I've seen is, I'll put this right before the pre-mult, is I add a merge node in here, and I am going to create a constant. I'll take that constant and sample the absolute blacks like that. See the color tone in there, and I will plug that in. I will also add a grade in between, and what you'll see now, if I take this merge, I'm going to set it to Hypose. So you can't, there it is. So you see Hypose right there, and that's a certain, the way that the influence of the grading of the black point is a specific range that actually works for kind of adjusting or color correcting the blacks here. So you can see if I take this and turn it on and off, it's actually added the kind of like, it just added this kind of color into the shadow areas alone. And of course you can take this grade node, which basically takes this constant, and multiply it up and down for influence. So now if I go ahead and take a look at the final result, you'll see that the Hypose, the grade, and I take the multiply up and down, I can increase that and decrease that, and then it'll start matching up with the background. I find that to be one of the techniques to kind of help blend the background, the CG, into the shot. So I hope this helps you guys understand the basics before we jump in, because believe you and me, this is definitely something that you want to get a hold of. And I found it very hard because no one was really explaining it to me really well. But I hope this gives you a good idea, and I highly recommend you practice with this example that I've provided. That will really help you kind of solidify the color grading aspects and how it works. There are tons of other things to do in here, obviously, for color grading and matching, but this is the basics.